Alright, so today may not apply to everyone, but I have gotten a lot of people asking about science fiction novel stuff recently. So as a result, I figured we might as well have a science fiction novel lesson regarding creating new technology, because that is a huge part of sci-fi novels. Your whole idea is the fact that you're doing the future, right? And so the future has new technology that's been undiscovered. And the main problem with you there is that, well, it's undiscovered and uncreated, so now what? How are you supposed to invent something that doesn't yet exist? I know this may seem obvious, but the biggest, oh no, Marker's already whining at me. The biggest thing you can do is research. Now, when I say research, I don't mean research and then use that exact device. I say research and then go forward where you can. So, for example, we used to have radios, right? And radios, we all knew how they worked, generally. Well, Ray Bradbury took the idea of your basic radio and said, what if we had one that fit in our ears? Bluetooth, anyone? He literally basically invented the idea of Bluetooth. Of course, no one says he did. Bluetooth takes all the credit, but he definitely did. But he did that based on basic research. He looked up how radios worked and then said, theoretically, we could get this small enough to fit in our ears one day. And he was right. Now, granted, you won't always be fantastically right when you do your research and be like, haha, we could do this, like Ray Bradbury. That was mostly probably just conjecture that turned out to be right. But, nonetheless, doing research can incredibly enhance your technology because of the fact that it means you are basing it in current technology that is then being extrapolated into potential future ideas. These potential future ideas have limitless possibilities, and as a result makes it so that you have limitless amounts of technology that you can work with and utilize. I mean, honestly, anyone seen Star Trek? Why does that feel so realistic? Because of the fact that when you look at everything, you're like, yeah, I could see that being a thing, 1,000 years in the future, whatever. It makes sense because based on the research that we know, we can feasibly consider that an idea in the future. Now, sometimes you extrapolate too far and people go, that'll never happen. But that doesn't mean that it can't happen. For example, I think it was Jules Verne. He wrote a futuristic story set in futuristic France. It was a sci-fi novel. And every single one of his publishers laughed him out of the room. They were like, this is ridiculous. Most of his predictions in his novel came true. Hilarious, right? So, to be fair, you can do all the research in the world like Jules Verne and still get laughed out of the room. But the research will help it be less likely that that will happen because you can say, hey, I did all this research, so theoretically, actually, yeah, you should stop laughing because I think I'm right. You can help back up your claims. And that'll also help with your readers too, because your readers like to see the research. The reason people read science fiction is because they want to see what's possible in the future. And so as a result, if you are able to back that up, your readers are going to be very, very happy. You're going to be very, very content. I'm going to switch markers and hopefully this one works better. All right. The second one is actually very interesting concept. I can spell magnification. I stayed up way too late last night. Magnification. Yes. You definitely tell I stayed up till 4 a.m. Okay. So, magnification. Now, when I say magnification, what I mean is that you're going to focus super in detail about a specific piece of tech that you know everything about. And then you're going to give less detail about things that you don't know that much about. You're just extrapolating. You're like, I'm not a rocket scientist, but theoretically I think we could create a rocket that works like this. And so because of the fact that it's theoretical, you probably don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole because any rocket scientist is going to go, you got this wrong. And that's going to end badly, unfortunately. So as a result, magnification can actually really help you because something you can do, for example, there was a guy that I was listening to his podcast and he talked about this magnification principle. It was the Rating Excuses podcast from, sorry, I thought I saw a fly on the window. The Rating Excuses podcast with Brandon Sanderson, Howard Taylor, and Dan Wells. Howard Taylor does a lot of science fiction, and with that he uses a lot of magnification. For example, He mentioned the fact that if you know a lot about guns, you could talk all about how this science fiction gun works, this newfangled, cool, futuristic gun, because you know how guns work, right? But if you have no idea how rocket science works, then just give a general gist. But because of the fact that you talked so in detail about this futuristic gun, people will just assume you know it all, you just can't deign to tell it right. And as a result, it gives the illusion of knowing everything, and the reader gets to assume a lot of things that you can just be like, sure, totally, I knew that. But in reality, you just use the principle of magnification to trick them into thinking you knew what you were talking about because you knew what you were talking about in a different area. It sounds crazy, but it actually works. After listening to that podcast a couple of years ago, I found that any science fiction story, whether short story or novel, that I read uses this principle, where they'll go super in depth on something, and then they'll basically leave out details on something else, but they'll give me just enough details that I'm like, oh yeah, this is probably how it works. And then I go back and reread it, and I'm like, they don't actually specify. But I thought they did because of this principle. It gives, you're basically doing a magic trick. You're like, look over here, poof, misdirection. It's literally a magic trick for writing. You can also use this same principle in fantasy. If you have a fantasy concept that is soft fantasy that you don't want to have to fully explain, you can absolutely use the principle of magnification in soft fantasy, where you can take hard fantasy concept and you explain it in depth with super hardcore rules, and then you just leave out the complicated stuff that you're like, I haven't figured it out yet. What else? And that also makes it so that you have a lot of leeway and room in future books for fantasy to retcon. Now, retconning is basically where you go back and you say, crap, I messed up, I need to fix that because I actually need this plot point to work, and this plot point won't work if this rule is in place. Well, if you use the principle of magic magnification, you don't need to worry about that because you never set up any rules. Ta-da! It's one of my favorite things to learn about is the magnification principle, because I did not know you could do that, and when I learned that, I'm so infinitely happy. That being said, you can retcon properly. If you guys want me to do a lesson on retconning, please either for the video comment below or let me know after that we finish this. Because retconning is very complicated and a lot of people do it incorrectly. Disney, a lot. Anyway, let's not go into that. I have a whole thing. Alright, so the third thing that I want to talk about with making your own technology is the character dynamic. Now, why am I talking about the character dynamic? Because if you decide that your character, one second, let me mark something down, is going to be a rocket scientist, and you know nothing about rocket science, Houston, we have a problem, pun intended. You're going to have huge problems trying to write this novel because your character dynamic would genuinely know about all these things. You genuinely have to have them spouting facts all the time about, oh yes, and it's 0 G's, blah, 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 blah. And you'd have to have them actually talk about that. Whereas if you have a character that's like, I just beat up stuff and fight things, and I don't know anything about the science, that's going to be a whole lot easier, because then the science person can be like, doing their blurb blurb, and then they're like, speak English, and you then can translate for the audience. So it's simplified instead of having it be like all this technical terminology and all this stuff that you have to learn. You have to do infinitely more research if you pick a character that knows what they're doing. Now, if you want to do that, by all means, great. Just know it's going to be a whole lot of work ahead of you. So if you choose to do a character dynamic that knows a lot, know there's work. If you choose to do a character dynamic that doesn't know a lot, that actually can be super helpful for info dumping, because then you don't have to info dump. Instead of having the rocket scientist be like, you're an idiot, explain. Then you can just be like, hey, well, I genuinely don't know anything about this because I came on as a security guard, so help me out, bro. And then they can explain it. This principle was used in the Avatar movie, the first one by Disney, with the blue people. Not Avatar: The Last Airbender, unfortunately, even though I love that too. The character dynamic helped because of the fact that his brother was a scientist, right? That's why he was going on the thing. But then he got killed, and they were like, well, you have the exact DNA markers, so we can just pop you in on board, and then we don't have to waste that money in that time capsule. But then, of course, it made it infinitely better because then all the info dumping felt genuine because he genuinely didn't know a single thing about this place or what he was getting into or any scientific knowledge really at all. And so he was able to have a unique perspective that allowed us to feel that info dumping was natural because it was necessary for him to understand it. Now, if we'd done it originally from his brother's point of view, it'd be a totally different movie, right? The whole thing would basically be space mumbo-jumbo science jargon. Like, it would not be the same at all. So the character dynamic ultimately helped that story to be better. Again, if you want to do a fancy science one, good for you. Awesome. Take the challenge. Just know, you might have to do a yay much world building before you even start writing. Alright, next thing is one tech. Now, this doesn't make sense, but I'm summarizing. You can take one piece of technology and infinitely use it in various ways. For example, lasers, right? You have laser surgery, you have laser tattoo removal, you have all sorts of different laser DNA-based things. Lasers have been used in so many different ways. You don't have to come up with a new piece of technology for everything. You can just use one piece of technology to have multiple different uses. For example, our air cooling system, right? Our AC works very similarly to a refrigerator. However, the difference is it's throughout a whole house instead of a tiny electronic box. Same principle though. As a result, you can use that one single piece of technology for multiple different things. A lot of people in science fiction tend to overcomplicate it and be like, I'm going to use lasers for this, and this for this, and this for that, and this for this, and this for that. And it starts getting really mind-boggling for your reader, and they start getting so bogged down in the details, they cannot read your story. The character and the plot get totally lost. So using just one piece of technology over and over again for multiple different uses can absolutely help smooth out the details and make things a lot more simple for your reader to understand. Now, I'm not saying that readers can't understand complicated things, but just saying that too much complication can let your reader feel intensely stuck. Have you ever read a novel where they have 20 different characters and a huge magic system that you know nothing about? Yeah, does that not feel a little bit like, okay, I need to take a break every once in a while just because your brain hurts? It's the same thing with using one piece of technology. This helps prevent the brain hurt because just like having 20 characters in a huge world building, having 2,000 pieces of technology is going to do the same thing to your reader's brain, and your poor reader's going to go, oh crap, I don't remember what that does, but that's cool, I guess. And it starts getting a little muddled. So if you want to avoid that, I would say take that one piece of technology and use it in multiple different ways. And heck, you can even use it in all sorts of crazy different other ways too. For example, genetic mutation technology. You can take genetic mutation technology and make tomatoes not freeze in the winter by adding fish DNA to them. Did you know they actually do that in some places? Yeah, crazy. They literally are like, well, fish have anti-freezing properties in their blood, so if we add fish DNA to tomatoes, they won't freeze as fast. It works, but also you now have fish tomatoes. It's wild that they can do DNA splicing like that. However, you can also use it to save someone's life from a genetic disease. Those are two drastically different things. One is, I don't want my tomato to freeze in the winter, and the other is, it's life-saving. Again, one piece of technology for drastically different purposes. You don't need to change it much. Alright, next thing is the good and the bad. Now, the main thing that people run into when they create new technology is that they have one of two perspectives on it, right? You either have the perspective of, it's all bad, it'll all turn bad, it'll all ruin society, panic, that classic point of view, dystopian kind of blah. And then you also have the, it fixes everything and there's no problems ever. You can't do that. You have to do both. You need both of these. This is a mess. You need both the good and the bad though. I'm not ending this, I'm just disastrous with that. All right. You need the good and the bad, though. When you're thinking of creating new technologies, think of how this can be used improperly. Because guess what? Unfortunately, doesn't matter if you invented this technology to save lives, someone is going to use it to kill someone. It is a fact of humanity that we have good people and bad people in this universe. And even if you built a perfect machine to be like curing some sort of crazy, crop blight or something like that, someone else could use it to then create the ultimate crop blight and wipe out the whole populace's food source, right? It's unfortunately a thing. For example, gunpowder is used in fireworks, right? That's a beautiful, wonderful, cool thing, right? I don't know about you, but I love some fireworks. May not always love how much sound they make. They're pretty dang loud. But fireworks can be really fun, but they can also be using guns! Exactly! I'm gonna read my mind. Well, Eli, sorry. But yes, they can also be used in guns and cannons and all sorts of exploding your facey things and murder. And then you can also think of all the good that can be used for those inventions too. Guns can be used by police officers to help protect people. They can also be used by bad guys to murder people. Every piece of technology can be used for good and bad, and you need to take that into account. You can't just be completely biasing your technological sci-fi working, because then your readers are going to get bored. They're going to be like, oh, here's another crazy person saying that all technology is bad, or oh, here's another crazy person saying that technology is perfect and all we need to do is evolve. Both are bad for different reasons. I personally believe there's balance in everything. I'm one of those people who doesn't feel too great about the AI movement, but at the same time, I also feel that it can be used in a lot of ways that could help people potentially. And so it's one of those things where it's like 6 of one, half a dozen the other, right? You have half of it that could be good, you have half of it that could be terrible. But that's the same thing with anything that you create. For example, radioactivity. It can kill people, but it's also been used in helping keep cancer at bay and different things like that. Doesn't always work, but at that being said, it's been used in those studies, correct? Right? I mean, it's no different than with poison, right? Poison can kill someone, but just the right amount of poison can be used in an antidote and in some vaccines. Sounds insane, but it's true. These are things to keep in mind when you're working through creating your technology. You need to make sure that your technology isn't black and white. There is always going to be gray area. There are always going to be people who use it for insane, crazy, psycho things that make people die and get murdered. It's sad, but it's true. We're not perfect human beings. Now, if you want to create a society where all human beings are perfect, magically, somehow, that's unrealistic completely and doesn't exist. But if you were to do that, then theoretically you could make all technology good. But that's a whole different can of worms. That's a different thing altogether. All right, next thing that we're going to talk about is social changes. Anyone else think that technology has changed how we interact socially? Yeah. Oh, heck yeah. There are so many ways that it has changed how we interact socially. Not only do we have social media, literally in the title, but also we have all sorts of crazy things like the fact that people who never would have even met each other before meet each other online. And then some of them even go as far as to go get in relationships and get married. Those two people theoretically might never have met. You could have one person who grew up in China meet with someone who grew up in freaking Utah, and they could theoretically be a thing, just via the internet. Isn't that insane? I don't know about any of the rest of you, but that's kind of insane to me. I mean, wild. It would have definitely helped a little bit back when they were, sending wives across the ocean and whatnot, where they're like, oh, we'll send you a bride. You have no idea what she looks like, or even if she's a woman. But there you go. Literally, people would do that just to get you to pay them to help them get across the ocean. But if you had social media, you might actually get a chance to get to know that person. Or you could be totally scammed as well. There are so many people out there who try to scam people still to try to come to other countries and are not the gender or person they claim to be. So that's fun as well. But that creates a different social change, right? A lot of people assume that because you see them on social media, they are who they say they are. Nope. And yet that is a social dynamic that has been created, right? That, oh, well, because I still talk to them on the internet, it's fine. No, absolutely not. That's not always the case. And I mean, it's no different than with the AI. That has created a huge social stigma, right? A lot of people are like, hey, what if I used AI for my art, for a book cover? And then the artists are sitting there going, I could have done a way better job than that. So now you not only have a terrible book cover, but you took money that could have been given to artists. And people, real people. It's created a huge social change and huge social dynamic. And then, of course, cyberbullying. That's created a huge social change. People now who used to be too afraid to say mean things to people will say mean things to people just because they don't have to look them in the face. It's real sad. But that is an example of, this is many examples of social changes. So when you create your technology for your sci-fi universe, think about the fact that this is going to create social changes. I haven't read the book, but I have seen the movie for I, Robot. It's an old movie, but it's actually really good. I would highly recommend possibly watching it. I can't remember if it's PG-13. I think it's PG-13. Anyway, I think it's PG-13 though. Social changes. It causes a lot of problems. For example, in iRobot, they have androids that help everyone, to the point where literally some of these parents aren't even raising their own kids. The robot is raising the kids.
That's stupid.
It is stupid. I'm like, holy cow, what are you doing? And then of course the robots all go crazy and everyone's like, what were we thinking trusting these robots? And I'm like, I don't know, what were you thinking? Lazy. Anyway, and Terminator as well, exactly. Why did you trust these things? But it would create that social change. Just think about it. How many people talk about like, oh, I am so exhausted, I need a break from my kids, my work, etc. So of course, they readily give it all away to the robots, and then the robots go nuts, and then they wonder why they trusted them. Maybe if you were a little less overtaxed, overworked, or just plain neglectful in some cases, maybe that wouldn't have happened. But it's a realistic social change. I mean, I could see that happening today. If a robot came out today that was like, I can raise your kids for you, I know plenty of people, not personally, but I know that plenty of people out there would totally do it. 100%. I know, like, I don't know anyone personally who would do that. Most of the moms I know, I would like to think wouldn't do that. But at the same time, I know that there are a lot of moms out there who are just overtaxed single moms and different things like that that would say, yeah, I could really use a break. And can you blame them? No. But it does cause a drastic social change. So you gotta think about that as well when you are creating your technology, because it is going to cause social changes in the long run. Now, next things. Economic. Econom. I wrote that M so squirrely that I gotta erase it. There we go. Economic. With economic changes, you are going to be changing how the market works. For example, with AI art again. A lot of artists aren't getting paid as much as they used to because of the fact that half of their clients said, AI art can create that, and left. First of all, they're wrong. AI art cannot do the same thing that a regular artist can do. It does not have the same personality. It does not have the same time and labor put into it. It's just not going to be the same. It's just not. But it does change the economy, right? As a result, a lot of small artists have gone out of business completely. I know that there's 1 or 2 small artists that I follow on Instagram that have said, hey, I watched before AI and after AI, my sales dropped by like 20-30%. That's insane, right? That's an economic change that you gotta consider. And then other economic changes, for example, anyone seen self-checkouts at Walmart?
Yeah.
That is another economic change that people are still having, but however, it's not quite the same. There are more jobs being created for the fact that people get to create these self-checkout machines and maintain them, but there are less jobs being created for people to check people out in line. So as a result, it's kind of this trade-off, right? Where the engineering community is booming right now, but the basic clerking community is waning and draining severely and has become a major problem in the economy. So make sure that when you create technology, also think about how it is going to affect the economy of your world. I mean, for another great example, even in fantasy, is to think about how magic is going to affect your economy. For example, if everyone has fire magic, why on earth do they need candle makers? They don't. Because you could just go poof, and your hand is now on fire, and you're fine. No candles needed.
They're lazy. They don't want to do that. No, me and man have to do it.
See, there you go. You can come up with ways to complicate the system in order to change your economy to be more simple, but you can also come up with ways. However, if you want it to be simple and just say people can create fire, then why did they need candle makers? That's going to change your economy, and that's going to change how your world looks too. It's going to drastically change what things look like. For example, in my own Dungeons and Dragons thing, Eli is familiar with this, we had someone who invented the pest of all pests, a fire-breathing snail. Oh boy. Anyway, with this fire-breathing snail, obviously came a lot of problems, especially because these ones were immune to salt. He specifically cast spells on them to be immune to salt, making it so that you basically can't kill these things. However, people started taking them in and either eliminating them entirely or domesticating them. Now it's to the point where they basically use them in lanterns, and they just sit there and kind of go, with the fire. And now half of them are domesticated. It's kind of no different than dogs and wolves, right? Wolves, kind of terrifying, right? Dogs, however, adorable, fluffy, cute, can be used to help sniff out drugs and all sorts of other things. Changes the world. It's all about how you look at your economy and think about it to the furthest degree. Like, I would say, take it from origin point as far as you can, and then take it one step back, and that'll be the perfect sweet spot for your realism in your economy and social changes. All right. Now, next thing, flaws. Now, we already kind of talked about the good and the bad, but the good and the bad is relating to people. So you have to have good and bad in technology because it relates to people, but you also have to have your technology have genuine flaws. Now, when I say flaws, I'm talking about defects, because not all technology is perfect, hence why we have the robot uprising. Anyway, that is a popular theme because flaws and ghosts in the machine, as they are called, are actually incredibly common. Having the term ghost in the machine is basically when something goes wrong and scientists have no way of explaining it because it's science out of their hands. So, with these flaws, these ghosts in the machine, these quirks that cannot be explained, they're going to happen. And also quirks that can be explained are going to happen. For example, a lot of people probably died inventing the gun. Never looked it up, but I would just wager a guess.
Watch what this gunpowder does.
Kaboosh in the face. Yes, exactly. And then even with like little kids, used to be a game. Did you know this? Where they would take a bullet, they would just set it on the edge of a rock and then hit a hammer and go bam and watch it fly away.
Oh,
yes, that was genuinely a thing. People got murdered because of flaws in technology and flaws in also human thinking. Crazy people. But anyway, these are just things that you need to consider. Things are going to malfunction. You can't have your gun always work perfectly. If you have this sci-fi gun that's like, haha, I'm going to murder everyone with this thing. Every once in a while, that thing's gonna misfire, right? Heck, even guns in TV shows. One of my favorite moments, even though it's like super intense, one of my favorite moments in murder mystery shows is when they're about to catch the killer and then the gun misfires, and so as a result, he can't shoot the killer, and the killer's coming faster. I like those moments actually, not only because it adds tension, but because it's realistic. Your gun will misfire. There will be problems with your tech that won't work. You will not receive messages on your phone because they, for whatever reason, decide not to. I had that happen last night. My husband messaged me, and for 20 minutes, I didn't even know he messaged me because my phone never buzzed. I was literally holding it. I know that it never buzzed. And I don't know why, but it didn't. And so flaws can happen in computer programming, in machines, in your basic technology, in guns, all of the above. So don't forget that your technology is not going to be perfect. Alright. Now the next one is probably the least favorite of everyone, but obviously there are rules. Now when I say rules, I say that you can bend and break the rules of science. Now some people are like, blasphemy, you're crazy! And like 7 people probably turned off the video right now for the future reference when I post this on YouTube. Seriously, I probably lost 7 people right there when I post this. Because of the fact that a lot of science fiction believers are like, you have to base it in modern science. Well, let me tell you right now, modern science isn't always correct. There was a very, very long time where modern science believed that if you drained someone of blood, it somehow made you better. Not a thing. There was also a lot of things in science that said that how trees grew had nothing to do with sunlight and everything to do with dirt, and that they absorbed dirt. They absorb nutrients through dirt, but they don't just go at the dirt. It's not like a straw. It's not a thing. So just because of the fact that science says no or science says yes doesn't mean you have to base your technology perfectly on the science of today. You can always say, well, what if theoretically we found out that this theory was wrong in the future, and I tweak it? Go for it. I say go for it. For all you hardcore sci-fi nerds, I'm sorry, I apologize, but also I don't. Because I think it's more fun that way, because science is the best wrong answer. Again, I probably just offended like 9 people. But science is the best wrong answer, it truly is. We will never get the perfect answer. I actually had a biology teacher that I completely and utterly related to and felt like they were teaching the right things, because we came into class and he gave us a box that was covered in tape, right? And it had a maze inside with a marble, and we had to try and guess what the maze looked like based on the way the marble, clattered inside and whatnot. And then we had to draw it. And then he was like, okay, do you guys want to see what the maze looks like inside? And we were all like, yeah. And he's like, you don't get to. And we were like, wait, what? What do you mean we don't get to? And he's like, because science, you never truly know if what you have is the right answer. You only know the best wrong answer at the time. It will always be wrong because you will never know the perfect right answer, but you will know the closest to the right answer. Theories can be disproved, theories can be wrong, and things can be found to prove and disprove things every day. That means that just like my biology teacher, you will never truly open the box and know what's inside. You'll always be guessing. That's why when I say rules, I say it's good to base it in the science rules we have today, because a lot of them are probably close to right. But that does not mean you have to perfectly base them in the rules of science today. I would say you are more than welcome to tweak things, but if you do tweak things, specify for your hardcore science nerds that this got proved to be wrong or that got proved to be wrong, and so as a result, this came about. And let me tell you right now, those are some of my favorite science fiction books, because it makes me happy to think that people are furthering ideas instead of just sticking to the rules and refusing to move. Alright. Next thing. Alright. The familiar. Now this applies to fantasy as well. So I'm going to try to connect it to fantasy as much as I can, just because I know a lot of you aren't sci-fi people. But I have, again, received lots of requests for this, so for those of you that are, you got to compare your technology or your magic to something that is familiar to people that they already know. For example, if you have a piece of technology that works like an iPad, but isn't an iPad for whatever reason, it teleports someone when you hit a certain switch, but it looks like an iPad for all intents and purposes. That helps people to not only be able to imagine it, but also be able to imagine how it works. That helps make it so that your reader feels comfortable where they are. So for example, I read a dystopian novel, I believe it was Ali Condi. Might have to correct that. It's the Matched series. Yeah, okay. It was like there's so many Allies, just like the Brandons. It's like which one was it? Anyway, but yes, Ali Condi with the Match series. A lot of what I loved about her futuristic dystopian technology was the fact that not only did she base it in current things that we know, but she then extrapolated it to things that were familiar to us. So she had a lot of computer technology, but that was extrapolated to be crazy. If she had a lot of things like iPads and things like that, but that were extrapolated into the future for different various uses. But it made it so that it was familiar enough to me that I was able to envision it and feel comfortable in the environment instead of feeling like I'd been totally placed into a foreign universe where I'm like, what the heck is that thing? And yes, you're going to have some of that in your science fiction novels, but it's nice to compare it to the familiar so your reader doesn't feel quite so out of touch. For example, that's part of the reason why a lot of people love books like Fablehaven when it comes to fantasy and things like that. Why? Because of the fact that we're all familiar with what an animal preservation kind of looks like, right? So now just add fantasy creatures. Boom, now you've taken the familiar and turned it into something strange and new that we can explore. But it's familiar enough that we can kind of like settle in and not feel too weird about it, right? Same thing with Harry Potter. Boarding schools. We all know that boarding schools exist and boarding schools are a thing in Britain. Now add magic. Poof! New thing. However, it's familiar enough that we're able to kind of be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. All right, that checks out. And it lets your readers sink into it a little bit more easily instead of being like, whoa, I don't know what that is. Maybe I won't touch it. It's too crazy. Unfortunately, we do like to have our familiar things. We don't like to have a completely foreign experience. So that's part of the reason why a lot of people say most books aren't original. That's because of the fact that if they were truly crazily original, you probably wouldn't want to read it because you'd be like, I don't know what any of this is. Unfortunately, that is the case. What? Even Brandon Sanderson has his familiarity. So I can see what you're saying. He feels the most crazy and out there, but honestly, a lot of his concepts have a lot of basis in things that are familiar to us. For example, with Mistborn, he has a basic medieval society as his base. He could have gone with a crazy cool new society that he invented all by himself, right? He went with your classic medieval and then twisted it with fantasy. And so as a result, even though his magic system is perfectly original and unique, his base was familiar to us. So that's what I'm saying when it's like, nothing's truly perfectly original, because if it was truly perfectly original, you wouldn't be able to identify it, and it wouldn't be identifiable to you. And that's what we love about reading, right? Is that we can feel like we identify it to it. So you are right. His magic systems are out of this world original, absolutely. But I would argue that his bases are always familiar. For example, his new Alloy of Law is absolutely based in Westerns. So it's something familiar that he then took crazy, weird directions. But yeah, so I would agree. Brandon Sanderson's generally an exception to every rule. He's special. We don't even try to be like, I can't even do a lesson about Let's Write by Brandon Sanderson, because it'd be like 2 seconds. The lesson would be, break all the rules, then fix them. The end. That would be the lesson. If you want to know how to write like Brandon Sanderson, that's it. Do that. And also find a very, 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 very patient editor. And then spend all your time writing. So maybe there's a few more things than that. But the basic thing is that he allows himself to break all the rules, but then he does it in a way that he fixes it so you still feel comfortable with it. But anyway, so that being said, the familiar is important unless you're Brandon Sanderson, but I love his stuff, but also he makes me frustrated because I feel like every single time it's like, but Brandon Sanderson, like I know. He's special. You're right, he's special, okay? I can't argue that he's done his own thing and he does his own thing. Yeah. Every author envies him for multiple reasons, one of which being that if they tried to break the rules, their editor would be like, him. But he breaks the rules and his editor's like, alright, gotta spend 5 all-nighters to fix this problem. And he's fine with it somehow. Oh, freaking Moisha, bless that man. He's incredibly talented editor. Yeah. must take a special soul to work with Brandon Sanderson's novels. All right, next thing is naming your technology. Now, why is this important? Because as we talked about earlier, with certain fantasy books like Brandon Sanderson's books and Robert Jordan's books and J.R.R. Tolkien's books, what do they all have in common?
Fantasy!
Fantasy, yes, but also the fact that you can't pronounce half the names. You just look at them and go, you're gonna do what? Yeah, no, they're not pronounceable. Yep, pretty much. You're just like, I don't know. If they make a movie one day, maybe I'll figure out how to pronounce it, but I don't know right now. It's just that. Whatever that is, it's just that. Yeah, Patrick Rothfuss is also another one that loves to do this. His whole thing, Name of the Wind, his first book, he literally has a pronunciation guide in it. Why? Because of this. Now, when it comes to science fiction, unfortunately, you can't do that in your science fiction. Why? Because your science nerds will lose their minds. Science nerds don't like you to make up random words that don't make sense. They like them to be logical and decently pronounceable. Not perfectly pronounceable. You can use Latin root words if you want. But if you use Latin root words, that's at least decently pronounceable. It's not where you throw together a bunch of consonants and then claim it's a name. Anyway. I love Patrick Rothfuss's work, but his main character, I have no idea how to pronounce that. Anyway, there's like 7 YouTube videos on, I think this is how it's pronounced, and then finally Patrick had to come out and be like, this is how it's pronounced. Because no one got it. So, naming. Make sure they're logical, pronounceable, and if they are some sort of medical thing, I would highly recommend having a Latin root or a Latin term. And then also making sure that your Latin term is not already coined for something else. And on top of that, I would say use the simplest Latin terms possible. Most of the time when you look up the translation for the Latin name for a thing, it translates into something ridiculously simple, like the 5-leaved death plant. And, well, it's a 5-leaved deadly plant. They weren't terribly original when they did these Latin names. They just wanted to sound fancy, okay? It was more academic. I'm sorry, I have issues with academic writing, but that's another story. That being said, with naming, your science fiction people will absolutely go nuts and bonkers in all the happy chemical ways if you use Latin naming systems, logical naming systems, or pronounceable basic acronyms. Acronyms? Is that what they're called? Yes. My brain doing the thing. For example, a bad way to do naming that people make fun of all the time is Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs with the whereas he has like the whole thing and then he's like and she's like, that's not pronounceable acronym at all. And yeah, because he was trying to be scientific and do an acronym, but the problem is he did it very wrong. When you do an acronym, make sure that you can easily translate it into some sort of name. And when I say name, I mean something like iPad, for instance, or Ben, bioelectronic navigator from Treasure Planet. That was a great example of that one, where it's like super easy to pronounce, super easy to figure out, and yet it means something super cool and sciencey, right? We like that as science fiction people. Or at least as every science fiction person I've talked to prefers when names are pronounceable. Unpronounceable names are for fantasy, I would argue. Unless you're doing some sort of alien race, in which case that is the exception. But that is the only exception. And even then, please try to make it semi-pronounceable. Alright, last thing that we're going to talk about today. Alright. Now, there's a lot of things you don't want to outweigh, so I'm just going to say don't outweigh. Make sure that your technology development, your world building development, all those kinds of things don't outweigh the character and the plot development and your overall arc of the series. Why? Because if you have so much info dumping about tech all the time, they're going to forget what the characters' names are because they're too busy keeping track of what the heck all this tech does to keep track of who the characters are, what they're doing, and what the plot is. So you want to make sure that you have character and plot together at top priority, 100% of the time. Then your tech is your nice little base that you talk about every once in a while, but you don't constantly go tech, 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 tech. Oh, by the way, there's a character thing. Tech, 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 character. Tech, tech, tech. By the way, there's a plot somewhere here. That's when people start to go, okay, this sounds more like a textbook than a novel. That's when you need to be careful. You're officially encroaching on too technological and not enough plot and character if your readers are starting to say that. So just make sure that you don't outweigh it. I would say this is a good rule. This is a good rule in academic writing. Again, I don't like academic writing, but this is one of the rules that actually makes sense that you can apply to fantasy and science fiction. For every one line of fantasy / sci-fi, I'm not trying to write pretty. For every one line of fantasy / sci-fi info dump world building, you should have at least 5 character plot base sentences. That helps make sure that this never outweighs this, because your character and your plot will always be more important and should always be prioritized over your world building and your science fiction technologicalness. There you go, that sounds better. So I would say yes, for every bit of info dumping you do, make sure that you have at least 5 sentences of character / plot building. That will help make sure that you don't go too overboard. Alright. Are there any questions about building technology in a science fiction universe? No questions? Okay. Well, if you guys have any questions for those of you watching the video, please comment them down below.